Kyle had always kept the memory of a first love who had passed away. By the 4th year of our marriage, he brought home a young girl who bore a striking resemblance to her. And I was the last person in the world to find out. That day, the girl and I wore identical red dresses. Kyle frowned at me and said, "Red doesn't suit you. Go change." I didn't change my new dress. Instead, I chose to change the husband who didn't like me wearing red. The girl pouted unhappily when she saw we were wearing the same dress. Kyle leaned in and whispered something in her ear. The girl, whose name was Nora, obediently turned and walked away. Then Kyle walked through the crowd, past the glamorous dresses and tailored suits, and stopped in front of me. He looked at me, frowning slightly. "Red doesn't suit you. Go change." As soon as he said it, the room fell silent. But I could feel the eyes of everyone around us, glancing at me furtively. The air was thick with tension when someone let out a mocking laugh and said, "How funny. So, she's just imitating someone else?" I looked up and saw who had spoken. It was Kyle's cousin, also the late first love's best friend. When we got engaged and married, no one ever told me about the first love who had passed away. I didn't find out until I was pregnant with Neil and nearing my due date. By the 4th year of our marriage, he brought home a girl who looked just like her. And still, I was the last to know. Seeing me sit there motionless and silent, Kyle's face darkened, and his voice grew sharper. "Emma?" I looked past the people sitting in front of me and fixed my gaze on Kyle. Maybe it was some private sentiment between lovers, but he was wearing a dark red tie that day, a rare choice for him. My eyes lingered on that splash of red on his chest. Suddenly, the noise around me faded into silence. Before he could speak again in irritation, I stood up, pushed back my chair, and walked away. Kyle's expression softened slightly. "Change your dress and come back quickly." I pressed my lips together and even gave him a faint smile. But I didn't say a word. I didn't go to the lounge to change out of my new dress. Nor did I return to the banquet hall. Instead, I walked to a side exit where no one was around and left. The weather had been gloomy when I arrived, and now a light, drizzling rain was falling outside. It was late spring, and the rainy night wasn't cold. I walked straight into the rain without opening an umbrella. When I got back to his house, the maid greeted me with a smile. The old madam brought Neil over. "She's waiting for you." Hearing this, my spirits lifted, and I quickened my pace. In the 1st year of our marriage, I gave birth to Neil. But Kyle's mother insisted I was too weak from childbirth to care for the baby and took him away when he was only a month old. I was devastated, nearly falling apart, but I was too physically weak to stop her. All I could do was cry and beg Kyle. In the end, the only concession I got was 1 day a week to see my son. I cherished that time, but it flew by too quickly. As Neil grew older, he became more and more distant from me. Climbing the steps to the house, I heard laughter inside. Neil was playing with a remote-controlled car, expertly maneuvering it. Kyle's mother, the maids, and the nanny were gathered around him, clapping and cheering. I couldn't help but move closer, my eyes fixed on his small figure. Neil glanced at me briefly, then returned his attention to the car. I patiently waited until he had finished playing and crouched down, wanting to hug him. But he turned and ran to Kyle's mother instead. "Grandma, I've seen Mommy. Let's go home now." He clung to her leg, nuzzling her affectionately. Kyle's mother beamed and picked him up. "All right, darling, we'll go home now." My hands were still outstretched awkwardly, but all they held was the cold, empty air. I always seemed to be slow to catch on, realizing things only after the fact. Like earlier, when Kyle humiliated me in front of everyone. It wasn't until the way home that I began to feel the sting. By the time Kyle's mother left with Neil, it had been a long while. I sat on the ground and cried silently. There seemed to be nothing and no one left here for me to hold on to. Late that night, I went upstairs to pack a few things, my documents and personal belongings. Everything else, I left untouched. As I passed through the garden, I saw the crabapple blossoms in the misty rain. I had planted those flowers myself the year I married Kyle. I loved them. But I only stopped to look at them for 2 minutes before walking away without glancing back. Kyle was slightly tipsy as he glanced at his watch. Emma had been gone for almost an hour. Changing a dress shouldn't take this long, the lounge was just upstairs. His frown deepened as he pulled out his phone and texted her. "Why aren't you back yet?" But there was no reply. Instead, his assistant approached him, bent down, and said quietly, "The driver reported that Madam has already gone home." Kyle's face grew cold. This was the first time Emma had acted out like this. And he hated it when women behaved that way. "Bring Nora here," he ordered. The assistant hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Yes, right away." When Nora returned, she had changed clothes, her hair was down, and her makeup had been carefully removed. Her eyes were red as if she had been crying, and her face looked pure and fresh. Seeing her like this, Kyle was momentarily stunned. "Did I do something wrong tonight?" Nora bit her lip, raising her watery eyes to look at him. There were 2 tiny moles near the corner of her left eye. Without makeup, they were even more noticeable, an uncanny resemblance to Sally, Kyle's first love. Kyle reached out to cup Nora's face. He leaned down and kissed the small moles, murmuring drunkenly, "Sally." It wasn't until 3 days later that Kyle realized Emma hadn't returned to the marital home. But he didn't pay it much mind. Emma was the youngest daughter in her family, but different from the others. She had gone missing as a child and suffered greatly before being found at 20. By then, her personality had been shaped, quiet, timid, and reserved. Her family didn't care for her, and neither did Kyle's mother. When they married, Kyle's mother set a condition: there would only be a wedding, and no legal registration until Emma gave birth to a son. Emma eventually gave birth to Neil. But even then, Kyle's mother never mentioned registering the marriage. Emma, being meek, never dared to bring it up herself. By the time Kyle returned to the house, a week had passed since Emma's departure. It was late April. As he stepped out of the car, his eyes were drawn to the crabapple blossoms, now wilting. Noticing his displeasure, the maid hurried to explain, "Madam always tended to them herself. She didn't let us interfere." "She hasn't come back yet?" Kyle asked as he walked toward the house, his frown deepening. The maid shook her head. "Madam hasn't returned." "What day is it today?" Kyle asked abruptly. "Saturday." "Has Neil been picked up?" Saturday was always Emma and Neil's day to meet. "Yes, he should be arriving soon." Kyle nodded, his expression returning to its usual calm. "Tell Emma that if she's not back within an hour, Neil will be sent back to the old house." Neil sat on the living room carpet, unpacking his new toy. A servant walked in cautiously and spoke in a low voice. "Sir, I've called Madam." Kyle responded with a curt acknowledgement, his gaze falling on Neil's delicate face. The boy bore a striking resemblance to Emma, especially those eyes, almond-shaped, with long, thick lashes. Even his fair complexion mirrored Emma's, making him an adorable little child. The servant hesitated, lingering for a moment before speaking again. "Madam said, she's not coming back." Kyle's head snapped up abruptly. The servant stiffened, her fear palpable. Even Neil seemed to sense something was amiss, placing his toy aside. After a long pause, Kyle let out a cold laugh. He stood and called Neil, "Neil, let's go. Daddy will take you home." Neil stood but hesitated, asking, "Aren't we waiting for Mommy?" "No, we're not," Kyle said, bending to pick him up. "Mommy's not coming back?" Neil's tone was curious, with a trace of joy that he didn't fully understand. Kyle carried Neil out of the living room and down the steps. As they walked through the withering garden of crabapple trees, Kyle finally broke the silence. "Mommy's been disobedient, so she's not allowed to come home for now. This is her punishment." These days felt like the most relaxing time since I returned to the Gone family, married Kyle, and gave birth to Neil. No more rigid 6:30 wake-ups. No more preparing breakfast tailored to Kyle's preferences. No more waiting anxiously for Saturday, only to end up sleepless and heartbroken. No more wondering what time Kyle would come home, or if he'd come home at all. I could sleep until 10, lazily get up, and cook myself a bowl of spicy beef noodles. I could binge-watch dramas until 3 a.m., sobbing into a pack of tissues. Even when Neil's kindergarten teacher called, inviting me to a parent-child activity, I felt a pang of sadness, but calmly explained. "I'm no longer involved with his father, Kyle. Please don't contact me about Neil's matters anymore. Thank you." After hanging up, I frowned slightly at the servant's weekly Saturday morning call from the Zhou family. Tomorrow would be Saturday again. At 9 in the morning, instead of waiting for the call, I took the initiative to dial the number. "Sir, it's Madam calling." The servant's voice sounded both excited and joyful. Kyle felt his chest tighten slightly, but his tone remained indifferent. "Tell her Neil isn't coming over today." The servant hesitated but relayed the message as instructed. Moments later, she returned. "Madam asks if you're available to take her call." Kyle set aside the newspaper, methodically folding his shirt sleeves, before extending his hand. "Give it to me." As he took the phone, he heard her soft breathing, a sound distant yet close, like a feather brushing against his heart. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he noticed the crabapple blossoms outside. He suddenly recalled the time she had nearly bumped into him, carrying a bundle of flowers, with a rare lively smile on her face. That had been one of her few moments of carefree happiness after their marriage. Kyle thought to himself, since she's lowering her pride to call, I'll give her an out. "Emma, do you realize your mistake?" There was a slight pause, followed by her gentle, flowing voice. "Kyle, we never registered our marriage 4 years ago." "I know," he replied, smirking nonchalantly. So, after all this, she was trying to formalize their marriage. To him, it was just a matter of procedure, something inevitable. "Then we don't need a tedious divorce process to separate now." The smile on Kyle's lips froze instantly. "What did you say?" His grip on the phone tightened. "I mean, don't have the servants call me every Saturday anymore. I won't be coming back. I've also informed Neil's teacher that I won't be involved in his matters." "Emma, what are you trying to say?" "Kyle, I'm not asking for any of your assets. The 8.88 million yuan and all the jewelry you gave me when we got married, I won't return them either. Consider it compensation for giving birth to Neil." In his 30 years of life, Kyle had never felt such rage. Yet the angrier he became, the calmer his voice sounded. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure." Emma's response carried no hesitation. Kyle abruptly ended the call. The servant, standing not far away, didn't dare make a sound. Just moments ago, Mr. Zhou seemed to be in a good mood, even smiling faintly. Everyone had sighed in relief, as the atmosphere in the house had been growing increasingly tense. But now, after hanging up, his face was icy cold and terrifying. "Take this phone away," Kyle ordered. He stood, signaling the servant to approach. After walking a few steps toward the door, he glanced at the crabapple blossoms outside. The sight made him even more irritable. Turning back, he commanded, "Reorganize the master bedroom upstairs. Move Emma's belongings elsewhere, I don't want to see them." The servant froze for a moment before hurriedly nodding. Kyle strode outside, his phone vibrating with an incoming call. It was from Nora. He glanced at it but felt no inclination to answer. A counterfeit will always be a counterfeit. Nora couldn't compare to Sally. Not even to Emma. That night, he truly shouldn't have embarrassed Emma. She had grievances, and she was stubborn. If she wanted to throw a tantrum, let her. Someone like her would eventually hit a wall and realize she needed to come home. But Emma seemed to have vanished. After that phone call, there was no further news. Once, when Neil wasn't feeling well, Kyle's mother brought him over, hoping Emma could massage him. Since Neil's birth, Emma had taught herself various child-rearing techniques. But the servant's call to her didn't go through. Kyle's mother was furious. "I've never seen such a heartless mother. If she doesn't come back today, she might as well never come back. We're better off without her." She stormed off with Neil, leaving Kyle sitting silently on the sofa for a long time. By evening, he instructed the driver, "Prepare the car. We're going to Emma's parents' house." When they arrived, Emma's parents seemed surprised but promptly welcomed him with deference. Noticing Kyle's dark expression, they exchanged wary glances. Did Emma make another mistake? The couple, who had gone to great lengths to reunite with this long-lost daughter, didn't care much for her. Especially since, after nearly 4 years, she still hadn't secured a marriage certificate with Kyle. Kyle paused, his hand holding a teacup. "She hasn't been home these past few days?" Their surprise deepened. "No, she hasn't." Kyle set the teacup down slowly. She hadn't returned to the family estate. She had no other place to stay in this city. Where had Emma gone these days? "Did you two have a fight?" Emma's mother asked cautiously. Kyle stood up. Just a minor disagreement. Then it must be Emma's fault. Emma's father frowned. I'll call her and give her a piece of my mind. Kyle stopped him. No need. We'll handle it ourselves. All right. Couples argue at the head of the bed and make up at the foot of it, Emma's father said with a smile as he escorted Kyle out. At the car, Kyle suddenly turned back. Emma's ID card, shouldn't it be here with you? Emma's father hesitated before smiling broadly. Yes, it's here. If you need it, I'll get it for you. Kyle shook his head. Keep it for now. When I need it, I'll have her come pick it up. That's fine. She can come get it anytime. Emma's parents watched Kyle leave, elated. They had long given up hope on Kyle and Emma registering their marriage. They'd even prepared for Emma to be kicked out, with Kyle marrying someone else. But now, it seemed like Kyle was seriously considering making their marriage official. For their family, this was monumental news. I visited the town where I grew up and stayed for half a month. After that, I traveled to many places I had always wanted to visit. I've always been frugal, and with this sizable sum of money in my hands, it's more than enough to sustain me for a lifetime. I've decided that if I find a town I like during my journey, I'll buy a small one-bedroom apartment and settle there. When I was a child, I was sold, adopted, and spent time in orphanages. What I longed for the most was a place that was entirely my own. The home of my biological parents was never my home. Kyle's house wasn't my home either. After all, for years of being married in practice, but not legally bound, meant no true security. Now that I've left that place, the only things I find hard to let go of are the flowers I planted myself and, of course, Neil, the child I fought so hard to bring into this world. But I also understand that staying with his father is the best choice for Neil. I'm different from others. From a young age, I grew used to separations. So even though I feel reluctant, I haven't been consumed by pain. Besides, with me gone, everyone is happier. Kyle can marry someone he truly loves. Even though I never truly held the title of Kyle's wife, I still freed him in the end. Eventually, I returned to the small town where I had spent several years of my childhood. The property prices there were very low. I initially planned to buy a small apartment but ended up purchasing a house with a courtyard. The people there were incredibly kind and honest. The most stable and happy period of my life was spent in this town. Unfortunately, the elderly couple who had fostered me for several years had already passed away. When I went through the property transfer process, I ran into my childhood playmate. Seeing me, Matt was pleasantly surprised. Sylvia, is that you? When I was adopted by the Lee family, they renamed me Sylvia. I was just as surprised to see Matt. I never expected the small courtyard I bought would turn out to be his family's old home. It's been so long, I said, looking at Matt as memories of those warm, distant times came rushing back like waves. I couldn't hold back my tears. Weren't you married? Matt raised his hand, as if to wipe away my tears like he used to when we were children, but stopped mid-gesture. Where's your husband and child? Didn't they come with you? How have you been all these years? I heard your biological parents found you. Were they good to you? I could only shake my head. I couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the urge to cry my heart out. That's how people are. They only dare to cry so freely in front of those they know truly care for them. It had been years since I last saw Matt, but seeing him now, I felt like the little Sylvia from my childhood again. And he, in turn, became the older brother who always carried me and comforted me. They weren't good to you, were they? Matt's eyes reddened. Of course not. If they were, you wouldn't have run here to buy a house alone. This town is hundreds of miles from Beijing. Sylvia, just how much have you been through? I tugged at Matt's sleeve, my tear-swollen eyes now showing a faint smile. Can you make that noodle soup you used to cook for me? Matt looked at me for a long moment, then ruffled my hair like he used to and smiled. All right, I'll make it for you. Kyle met Nora one last time. At that evening's banquet, Nora had been radiant, blooming like a flower in full glory. But now, she looked visibly haggard. Don't call me anymore, he said. And let's not meet again. I'll leave you the house and car. Kyle looked at her, her long hair falling over her shoulders, her face bare of makeup, appearing delicate and pitiable, just like Sally once had. But for some reason, he felt no emotion stir within him. I won't be coming back here, Kyle said before turning to leave. Nora began to cry. I don't understand. We were fine before. You said you really liked me. I never liked you, he said flatly. But you told me you wanted me to stay by your side. I have a wife. But you don't like her, do you? Kyle lowered his eyes, staring at the wedding ring on his finger. Don't like her? If he didn't like her at all, there were 1,000 ways he could have ended their marriage. Yet, from the first time he met her, he had felt a sense of tenderness toward her. Emma was too timid, too quiet. Often, she seemed like a shadow, barely noticeable. But in the months since she left, Kyle found himself strangely unsettled. He had tried going out with friends, indulging in nightlife, seeking new distractions. He even met women who resembled Sally more than Nora did. Yet none of them stirred him. Even Sally rarely crossed his mind anymore. Instead, he often thought of Emma. They had been married for 4 years, and despite her shyness, Emma still blushed when they were alone. When she smiled, there were dimples at the corners of her lips. Like Neil, her skin was fair, and she was beautiful. Reflecting now, Kyle realized that in those 4 years of marriage, their intimacy had never felt like a chore to him. In the months she'd been gone, he hadn't touched Nora. Just last night, he had dreamed of Emma, vivid, intimate dreams. Kyle suddenly instructed his driver, stop by a flower shop on the way. He bought a bouquet of red roses. Later that evening, he also bought a red dress. Emma looked stunning in red, it perfectly complemented her fair skin and delicate features. He decided to take a step back, to bring the flowers and dress, and ask her to come home. I settled into my new life. Matt, who had started a business after graduating from university, was busy with work in the city. But every weekend, he would return to the small town to spend time with me. The elderly neighbor often teased me kindly, Sylvia, I can tell Matt really likes you. That day, when you were watering the flowers, he stood there pouring tea, and the cup overflowed without him noticing. Through the fence, she smiled, her face wrinkled but warm. Sylvia, Matt is almost 30 and still hasn't married. Why don't you just marry him? After all, when you were kids playing house, Matt was always your groom. My rascal of a son never got over it. Matt was good to me, better than he had been when we were kids. Even though I'm a slow person, I'm not oblivious. I've been married before, after all. How could I not sense his feelings? I don't know anything. I never went to university or learned a skill. He's so accomplished. His future wife will surely be just as remarkable. I smiled faintly, recalling how Kyle never took me to important events. How his family never truly accepted me. How I didn't even have the right to raise my own child. If I had grown up with my biological parents, studied hard, and earned a good education, competent and capable, maybe that marriage wouldn't have failed so miserably. Someone like me is probably better off living alone. Who says that? Matt's voice suddenly came from outside the fence. In the glow of the setting sun, he stood there in a simple white shirt and black pants, tall and elegant. The once silent, skinny boy had grown into a strong, upright man. Someone who could shield and protect the people he cared about. Sylvia, you're wonderful. Don't belittle yourself. Am I? I looked at Matt, bewildered. If I were truly wonderful, why didn't my family, my husband, or even my child like me? Of course you are. Matt pushed open the door and walked into the courtyard. Everyone has their own purpose for being here, he said. If they don't see that, it's their loss. But I still couldn't believe it. Matt spoke to me as if he were comforting a child, using the simplest examples to prove his point. You're good at growing flowers. The same type of flower always blooms more vibrantly in your care. A few days ago, I was working overtime, and you helped organize my files, data, and spreadsheets. You made everything so simple and clear, it was a huge help to me. If you let me, I could talk about your merits for 3 days and nights straight. Matt laughed, and even the auntie nearby joined in. I could go on for 3 hours myself, she said. The cloud of gloom over my heart seemed to dissipate just like that. That evening, for the first time, I told Matt about Kyle. And I also told him about Neil. Matt fell silent for a long time, saying nothing. Later that night, he drove back to the city. When I heard his car pulling away, my heart was surprisingly calm. In my short 20-something years of life, I've faced too much separation. It's as if I'd become numb. It wasn't until almost dawn that I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep. But not long after, I was awakened by the sound of a car. Dazed, I got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. I saw Matt getting out of his car, holding something in his hand as he quickly made his way to my door. "Sylvia," he called, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb the neighbors. I hurried to open the door. "Matt?" He stood there, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes were unusually bright. "If you're willing, if you don't mind that I'm much older than you, let's go register our marriage today." "Register our marriage?" "Yes, get married." Matt's tone was serious. "After we're married, you'll have a home, Sylvia." The word home held a temptation for me that was 100 times stronger than for most people. For Kyle, marriage registration was just a procedural formality. But for me, it was a monumental decision. Yet, as someone who had been displaced and forced to rely on others for so long, I'd learned early on to gauge others' moods. That's why I never asked Kyle to marry me. It's almost laughable. Someone as humble as me, still refusing to beg for scraps. "Sylvia, I was too young back then to keep you by my side," Matt said. "Later, when I went to college in another city, I asked around about you. And when I heard your family had found you, I was genuinely happy for you. I thought, with your biological parents being so wealthy, they'd surely treasure the daughter they'd finally gotten back. And I was just a poor student then, so I didn't want to disturb you." There was deep regret in Matt's eyes. "If I'd known they wouldn't treat you well, I would have come for you. My parents used to talk about you often. Even when my mom passed away, she still called your name. If they don't want you, if they don't care for you, I do. Sylvia, I never planned to get married. But fate brought you back to me." His voice caught, and he choked back his emotions. "I don't want to lose you again." Tears streamed down my face, without my realizing it. I was abducted as a child and sold. My adoptive mother, after having a son, no longer wanted me. I was constantly beaten, left to freeze, and worked to the bone. It was Matt's parents who took pity on me and cared for me for a few years. Later, my adoptive mother forcefully took me back and sold me to someone else. In that house, I was beaten often, so I ran away. I stayed in an orphanage for a while and was briefly fostered. But my wandering never seemed to end. I had thought about coming back. But I was afraid of being captured and sold again. So I never dared. I never expected Matt to have been looking for me all this time. Nor did I know that his mother remembered me even on her deathbed. And I never imagined that Matt and I would reunite like this. Perhaps this is what true destiny feels like. Everything in the past was just preparing me for this moment. I cried my heart out but looked at Matt and shook my head with a smile. "I can't register our marriage today. Sylvia." I saw the light in his eyes almost shatter, and it hurt me deeply. So I gently took his hand. "My ID is still at my parents' house. Going back and forth will take a whole day." I didn't expect retrieving my ID to go so smoothly. Nor did I expect my parents to be so kind and loving toward me. This was everything I had once longed for. But now, it felt insignificant. When I left, they smiled and said, "Once you've registered, bring Kyle home for dinner." I knew they had misunderstood. But I didn't explain. Why complicate things unnecessarily? Knowing their ways, if they found out I was marrying someone with a fraction of Kyle's wealth, they'd be furious. After leaving, I headed straight to the airport. On the way, I got a call from Matt. "I can't wait any longer. I just landed, wait for me. Let's register our marriage in this city." I couldn't help but smile. "All right, I'll wait for you." I quickly told the driver, "I'm not going to the airport anymore. Please take me to the Civil Affairs Bureau instead, as fast as you can." The day after Matt and I got our marriage certificate, he took me shopping. Jewelry, clothes, and 2 luxury bags. I didn't particularly like these things, but Matt insisted. "If others have them, you should too," he said. He also took me to pay respects to his parents. He wanted to hold a proper wedding. He even bought me a red dress for the occasion. When I tried it on, I felt a little shy, holding the hem as I walked into the courtyard. It was the most beautiful spring day. At dusk, the crabapple blossoms were still in bloom. I looked at Matt, and for some reason, Kyle's words came to mind. "Do I look bad in red?" I asked. Matt shook his head. The ever-composed man who would always ask permission before holding my hand suddenly leaned in and kissed me. "You're the most beautiful woman in the world," he said. I froze, then couldn't help but smile. Just as Matt was about to pull away from the gentle kiss, I tilted my head up and slowly closed my eyes. Kyle stood outside the simple picket fence, his hand gripping a red rose that slipped from his grasp, its petals scattering. He saw the sweet smile on my lips, the dimples that made me look even more radiant when I smiled. But they pierced his heart like a dagger. He lost control and shoved the door open with a loud bang, startling both Matt and me. "Kyle?" I said, stunned. Matt immediately pulled me into his arms, his face full of caution. Kyle didn't spare Matt a glance. He stepped forward and grabbed my wrist. "Come back with me." But I didn't move. I even pulled my hand away forcefully. Kyle turned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Emma, I'll say it again. Come back with me. I've already made it clear, I won't go back." "You've always wanted to register our marriage, haven't you?" Kyle pulled out his household registration book. "If you come back with me now, we can register tomorrow." "But I'm already married," I said. Kyle felt as if something had exploded in his ears. "What did you say?" "Kyle, I'm already married. Just yesterday, I registered my marriage with Matt." I calmly looked at him. "The documents I took yesterday." Kyle seemed to be amused by my words. "Don't forget, you were married to me for 4 years, and you gave birth to Neil." "I haven't forgotten, but I want to clarify something. We never officially registered our marriage. Our union has no legal standing. So, Kyle, I'm not exactly married to you. Go back now. From now on, you'll need to take good care of Neil." After saying that, I turned around, no longer looking at him. "Matt, let's go inside. I'm a bit tired." I took Matt's hand, and he immediately squeezed it tightly. "All right, I'll take you to rest." "Emma." But Kyle stepped forward and grabbed me again. "Neil misses you." I felt a lump in my throat, and in the next moment, my eyes welled up with tears. Neil was only a little over 3 years old, and he didn't understand anything. Even though he wasn't very close to me, I never held any resentment toward him. Some mother-child bonds just aren't meant to be. "You come back with me. I'll have someone bring Neil over. From now on, the 3 of us can live together." The pain in my heart made me want to cry, and it all felt so ironic. So he knew everything. He knew I missed Neil, knew I dreamed of being reunited with my son. But he just stood by and watched Kyle's mother take Neil away. Now, I wanted nothing. I was leaving. But he wanted to bring Neil back. So Neil could be brought back after all. It turned out, some forms of filial piety didn't have to be followed. "Kyle, it's not necessary anymore." I jerked my hand out of his grip once more. "There's no need for the 3 of us to be together. If Neil misses me, he can come see me. If you allow it, I'll visit him regularly. But Neil is your biological son. You almost lost him during childbirth, he was the child you fought so hard to have. You don't want him? Aren't you afraid that if I remarry one day, that woman will mistreat him?" I had never seen such a look on Kyle's face. Even when he was angry before, it was always gentle. But now, his expression was fierce, his handsome face looking almost twisted. When Neil was born, they had used him to threaten me. And now, as I was leaving, they were using the same tactic again to try and manipulate me. But I was no longer afraid of losing anything. Matt had taught me. He said I am Emma first, then a wife or a mother. Those years had passed in a haze, and I had long lost myself. If others looked down on me, it wasn't entirely their fault. So now, I was going to be myself again. Neil was the child I fought so hard to bring into this world, but he's also your flesh and blood. He was raised by his grandmother since he was a month old. She's loved him for over 3 years, and I don't think she'll let him suffer. Besides, if that day ever comes. I took a deep breath. "Kyle, I'll take you to court and fight for custody of him." "So, you're determined to be with him?" he asked, his voice cold. I nodded. "Yes. Just for a red dress?" Kyle scoffed. "Emma, over these 4 years, what have I given you that he can give you? It's not just for a red dress." I looked up at Matt. There was anger, frustration in his eyes, but more than that, there was tenderness and guilt. "Kyle, there are many women you can like. But in my husband's heart, there's only me. I've cut ties with Nora. And Sally, I've already moved on. Regardless, we were married for 4 years. I don't feel nothing for you." Kyle furrowed his brow deeply. He clearly didn't want to talk about these things. He didn't want to admit that he still had feelings for me. It seemed like someone like me was a gift from someone in a higher position. A kind of gift that couldn't be shown in public. But I no longer yearned for that faint affection he was willing to offer. As the evening deepened, the begonia flowers I had planted myself still looked beautiful. Even more so than the begonia trees in the garden. Kyle said he had let go. But hadn't I also let go? 4 years had worn away the initial infatuation. Now, I just wanted to live a quiet, ordinary life. "Kyle, I once liked you. But now, there's nothing left. Go back. And don't come looking for me again. You should marry someone with the education and experience to match you, someone you can proudly show off. Not someone like me, who only knows how to tend to flowers and plants. I'm sorry, Kyle, for wasting these 4 years of your life." I stood in the night wind, giving Kyle one last glance. In truth, I was really grateful to him back then for not breaking off the engagement and marrying me. Because at that time every moment with the gone family felt like torture. Kyle took me away from my biological parents, gave me a temporary home. For me, it was a kind of salvation. After all, if he had called off the wedding, my biological parents might have sold me to any man like a commodity. And for someone like me, who had been sold several times as a child, that would have been a nightmare. So even now, I still hoped he would live a good life in the second half of his years. I didn't want to become bitter enemies with Neil's biological father. If we could part peacefully, that would be the best outcome for everyone. Kyle's perspective. Emma and Matt's wedding was quite grand. In fact, for Matt's financial situation at the time, the wedding budget was relatively high. But he was willing to spend it, and others naturally admired his deep affection. Emma cried at the wedding, and she cried pretty badly. When she married me, she didn't cry like this. She even said, "My life before has been full of hardships. I'm really thankful for my husband." Hearing those words at the time was really hard to bear. In the 4 years she was married to me, I can honestly say I wasn't bad to her. In my circle, keeping mistresses is common. What man hasn't had a few lovers? But I only got obsessed with one, Nora. And quickly got tired of her. Other than that, I kept myself relatively clean. I didn't believe Matt could truly be faithful. A man without money cheats, let alone one with money. So, I've been supporting Matt's company behind the scenes. Matt's company has grown bigger, making more and more money. Naturally, there would be more temptations. At that point, a woman like Emma, with her temperament, certainly wouldn't tolerate it. If she divorced Matt, I would bring Neil to find her, and maybe she would return to us. But in the blink of an eye, over 10 years had passed. Matt didn't make a single mistake. Emma had a daughter for him. She looked just like Emma. I was extremely jealous. Neil grew up, but he started looking more and more like me. Although they both looked great, looking like me, a lonely bachelor, wasn't such a good thing. Emma and Neil's relationship had grown better and better. Sometimes Neil would stay with her for a few days. Emma would naturally let him take his sister along to play. The bond between the siblings was strong. Sometimes Emma would come over to see Neil. When they spoke, I would be out in the garden, tending to flowers. Every time, I wanted to send her back. But Matt always came to pick her up himself. He was as wary of me as if I were some kind of monster. But this wasn't too bad. Matt had me as a warning, so he wouldn't make the same mistakes all men make. And as for Emma, her remaining years would naturally be filled with happiness. The end.